Richard Niles. What's going on? I'll tell you. My rare and historically significant interview with legendary Motown arranger David Van DePitte, recorded for my BBC Radio 2 documentary series in 2002. Although not as widely recognized as some of his peers, David Van DePitte's contributions were crucial in shaping the sound that distinguished Motown in the 1970s. His work continues to inspire arrangers and producers across genres. He passed away in 2009 at the age of 74. So listen now and enjoy our interview, a rare view from the shop floor of Motown's production line, working with Marvin Gaye, Gordy, producers such as Frank Wilson, and musicians such as his friend James Jamerson. No one with soul will want to miss this. And did you guys realize what you were actually creating? I mean, most record companies kind of discouraged doing things that were too different or too far out, but the variety and range of Motown music was enormous. But at the time, did you guys realize that?
Oh my goodness. Well, that's a great question, actually, because I've never given it a great deal of thought. I could say this, that Motown was one of the first companies that put unusual kinds of instrumental combinations on pop music. We had an orchestra there that we could play with and do almost anything we wanted. I don't ever remember being refused any instrumentation I asked for, no matter how ridiculous it was. They would give anything a try, just to be fresh and different and new and doing something other than what the rest of the folks were doing out in the recording world. So we would go in and ask for things like a string session with all cellos and no violas and violins, and nobody would say, gee, are you wacky? They'd say, well, fine, whatever you need. I can remember having done a recording session with French horns and tenor saxophones. And that was it. This was a track that I did with Frank Wilson on the Four Tops. I don't remember the specific track, but Frank decided that we were going to try a different kind of an approach and use a bottom-end sound, as he called it, which to him meant low strings and low kinds of horns. And he said, well, what about French horns and cellos? And I said, well, that's a gorgeous sound. I said, I have no idea what that has to do with R&B, but we can certainly take a whack at it. And as it turned out, it came out very nice. There was another time when I did a Christmas album with the Marvelettes. Smokey Robinson was producing it. And Smokey came to me and said, David, I have this idea. He said, I would like to do a Christmas album, but he said, I want to do it with a legitimate string quartet and rhythm section. And I said, well, gee, Smokey, if you can get past Barry with that one, it's fine with me, So he said, yeah, well, let's do it. So we did. When we used the standard legitimate woodwind quintet and rhythm section, and it came out really neat. It was fun. And the players had a lot of fun playing it, too. So I guess it boils down to the fact that we were allowed an awful lot of room for experimentation. And because of that, we got to use a lot of strings and horns that other people weren't necessarily using at the time. And I think that was one of the prime differences in the Motown music. Their ability, or willingness, rather, I should say, to allow us to try different things,
Sure. So in the normal world, budget sort of controls how many instruments you get. What was your normal size string section?
Our standard string section was approximately 17 strings. We used, I think it was 9 violins, I think it was 3 violas, 3 cellos, and a harp, and sometimes we'd augment that slightly, to beef it up a bit. But by and large, that was all we really needed, because the R&B strings, you didn't need a whole lot of strings on those kinds of records to make them heard and make them effective,
Sure. And I guess, of course, everything depended on what record you were making that day.
Yeah, that certainly did vary project by project. And quite honestly, a lot of the producers had their own pet little groups that they liked to use, a particular sound or what have you. But we'd use anywhere from 2 trumpets and a trombone and a couple of saxophones on up to 4 trumpets, 4 trombones, 5 saxophones, whatever it took. And we'd use French horns quite a bit. We used a lot of woodwinds, and I think that was another thing that was distinctive about the Motown sound, if you will, and that was the fact that we used a lot of piccolo and flute and oboe, doubling strings, things like that, and it gave it a different sound than, what other folks were doing at the time.
So, how much input would you actually get from the producers themselves?
That would depend again on the producer. We had, as you can imagine, we had a wide range of people there. There were people who were totally, I would say, musically illiterate. I mean, they really, really didn't know much of anything about music. They knew what they liked and they knew how to put things together, but they had no way to converse with you or tell you what they were really looking for. And then we had other people who were really quite proficient musicians, etc. And so it ran the gamut. There were times when people would come to you and say, I need strings on this. And you would hear the song and you would say, nah, you really don't. I mean, this is not a string. You might use a little brass here or there. And they would say, oh, okay. And they'd sort of just leave it up to you. There were other times when people would come to me with specific instrumentations in mind, and say, like a Frank Wilson, for instance, who was quite specific. And he'd say, I want this. I want a contrabassoon. I want something, whatever. And he had a game plan in mind, like on the Still Waters Run Deep album that I did with Frank Wilson, which was a Four Tops album. That album, we used some different kinds of instrumentation than we normally would have. Nothing spectacular, but just a little different. And Frank had everything all sort of mapped out in his mind as to what kind of a sound he was looking for. But there were other times when people would come to you and they would have no clue as to what they were really looking for. They would say they would like it to sound like, and they would give you another record maybe or something that, can you make it sound like this? And your clue was, of course, that particular record. And you'd say, well, there are strings on there, there's some brass on there, or whatever have you, and you'd go from there. But it was quite interesting. There was a time when Frank Wilson called me late of an evening and said, gee, David, you got to come over to the house. And I said, gee, Frank, it's really late, He said, come on, this is interesting. So I went over to the house and he introduced me to a young man who was about 16 years old. And he said, this young man has a song he's going to play for you. And the fellow picked up a guitar. And I promise you, the guitar had two strings on it, the low E and the low A. And he started playing these two strings, and he was playing open fifths and things like that, and whatever have you, and some thirds or whatever he could get his hands on. He was humming this song. And Frank said, I know there's something in this song. I said, well, yeah, I'm sure there is, Frank, but I have no clue whether this guy's in a major key, a minor key. I really don't know. And so we kind of sussed it out and worked with it. And it turned out to be Stone Love, which was a hit for the Supremes. But it just came off of a two-string guitar from a young man who could barely play, So you never looked at anything as being totally ridiculous. You had to really take a good look at everything because you never knew where the next hit was coming from.
No, but of course, I've been in situations like that before myself, and I know how tricky it can be. How did you actually work it out with the kid?
Yes, that particular evening was very interesting because what I did was we recorded it on just a cassette recorder, and then what I did was play it back and play chords on the piano for the young man until I hit a chord that he thought was the right chord that he really meant to play but didn't have enough strings to deal with. And it was chord by chord by chord until we finally hung together a verse and then hung together the chorus, and then, of course, they're quite repetitive, so once you get most of it together, the rest of it sort of falls in place. And you're absolutely right. It was like pulling teeth, quite frankly, but it was interesting.
Can you tell me something about which producers you really enjoyed working with and why?
Oh, gee, I had quite a few. Frank Wilson was one of them. I have mentioned him several times. And he was really an open-minded, musical kind of fellow, and that's what I liked about him. He really, really was sort of open-minded to anything you could possibly come up with. And he gave me an awful lot of musical freedom. He didn't tie my hands very much. He was quite good about that. Marvin was good to work with. I enjoyed working with Marvin. He was a lot of fun to work with. Smokey was fun to work with. There were several. I would say offhand, probably Frank Wilson was probably my favorite guy, simply because we did a lot of musical stuff together, and it was always different with Frank. It was never a great deal of repetition. He was always looking to be on the cutting edge and trying something new, and it was fun. It was really enjoyable.
Fun indeed, but how were you actually paid? I mean, it was by the song, by the hour, by the day? What was it?
It was piecework. It was absolutely piecework. It was paid by the song, by actually it was broken down because of the way we worked, as I described earlier, where I might do the rhythm parts and someone else might do the strings and someone else again might do the horn parts. It was broken down to where we got paid by doing a rhythm arrangement and then a horn arrangement and then a string arrangement. And if you were lucky enough to have done all three, then you got all three parts of the paycheck. But if you hadn't, then it was divvied up according to who had done what.
And there was no kind of retainer at all?
No, there really wasn't. It was just strictly piecework. That's all it was. And you had to work to get your paycheck.
So even though you were on call the whole time, 24/7, you didn't get paid if you didn't work.
Absolutely. You got it. That's exactly what happened. It was very interesting. There were a few days of twiddling thumbs in the early days, but not so many.
So you guys were contributing to some of the biggest hits of the period, and yet there was no retainer while you were working, and also you got no royalties for any of the work that you'd done, sometimes contributing important melodies and hooks for the songs?
No, absolutely not. The only thing that we can say is that when the music is used other than in the context of a record, in other words, if the recording is used in a movie or if it's used for a TV program or something, we do get compensated for that. It's called the new use provision, and that is accommodated by the union. But other than that, no, there are no royalties or anything like that involved. So it was just piecework, and good luck to you. And of course, it's generated an awful lot of funds over the years, as you well know. Some of the fellows were fortunate enough to have their names included as songwriters, in which case they were paid songwriter royalty over the years. But that didn't happen very, very often.